Karen tried to steal my parking spot, so I made it my fortress. It all started with something so small, so seemingly insignificant, that most people wouldn't have given it a second thought. A parking spot, just a strip of pavement in front of my own house, a space I had used for years without trouble, without complaint, without anyone daring to challenge it. But in neighborhoods like my neighborhoods patrolled by self-appointed guardians, gossiping neighbors, and the ever-watchful eyes of the HOA, small things rarely stayed small. Karen lived across the street. She wasn't new to the neighborhood, nor was she unfamiliar with me or the way things worked. Everyone already knew her reputation: loud, nosy, quick to complain, and always ready to escalate even the smallest inconvenience into a community-wide drama. She thrived on control, so when she began eyeing my parking spot with the hunger of a hawk circling its prey, I should have known what was coming. The first incident was subtle. I came home late one evening to find her car planted squarely in front of my house. She had her own driveway, large enough for her sedan and even her husband's truck. But that didn't matter. She had chosen mine. I brushed it off as a fluke. Maybe she had visitors. Maybe her driveway was blocked for a moment. But the second time, and the third, and the fourth, it became clear this was no accident. Each time I confronted the situation not with words, but with actions. I parked as close as I could behind her, forcing her to squeeze out in the morning. I left polite notes on her windshield, reminding her that the space belonged to my property line. But Karen didn't take hints. Instead, she doubled down. Her car would be there in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening. Sometimes she would move it, only to return a few hours later as if daring me to challenge her. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was insulting. That spot wasn't just pavement, it was mine, a boundary line, a piece of control over my own home. And the more she took it, the more it felt like she was trying to take something bigger: my authority, my peace, my right to claim what was mine without interference. The HOA, of course, was useless. When I brought it up, they shrugged it off as shared neighborhood space and not worth escalating. But I knew what that really meant. Karen was one of them, one of the loudest, most persistent complainers at every HOA meeting, always pushing for stricter rules, always inserting herself into other people's business. If there was ever a dispute between me and her, I already knew which side they would take. That was when something inside me shifted. I wasn't going to argue with her. I wasn't going to beg the HOA for fairness. I wasn't going to play her game anymore. Instead, I was going to take back control in a way that nobody, not Karen, not the HOA, not the whole neighborhood, could ignore. I started small. Bright traffic cones appeared on the edges of my parking space. At first, they were easy enough for Karen to push aside. But they made a statement. This space was marked. This space was mine. When she moved the cones, I brought out reflective chains and linked them between the cones, creating a clear barrier. When she cut through those, I escalated again, building a waist-high wooden barricade lined with reflective tape and anchored into the ground. Neighbors began to notice. Some laughed, some whispered, some shook their heads in disbelief. But every layer of defense I added sent a message. This wasn't just a parking spot anymore. This was a fortress, a monument to defiance, a physical reminder that I would not be walked over. Karen, of course, didn't take it lightly. She complained loudly to anyone who would listen, pointing at my barricades like they were a personal insult. She stormed into HOA meetings demanding action, claiming my fortress was an eyesore and a safety hazard. But for once, the HOA was hesitant. After all, everything I had done was technically within my property line. I wasn't breaking rules, I was just protecting what was mine. As weeks passed, the fortress grew. I installed steel posts in the ground, painted them with bright colors, and topped them with solar lights that glowed at night. A heavy-duty chain lock between them made it impossible for any car to enter without my permission. And then, to crown the whole project, I placed a custom metal sign that read, "Reserved parking violators will be towed." It wasn't just a parking space anymore, it was a declaration of war. But what I didn't realize then was that this was only the beginning. Karen wasn't done, and neither was I. The parking spot was just the spark that lit the fire, and soon, what started as one neighbor's petty theft would explode into a full-scale neighborhood battle. And as the fortress stood proudly outside my home, gleaming under the streetlights, I knew one thing for certain: This fight was far from over.
The fortress stood proudly outside my house, and for a brief moment, I felt victorious. No longer could Karen casually slip her car into my space. No longer could she treat my property like her own. But if I thought that was the end of it, I had underestimated her. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. She was the type to scheme, to plot, and to strike back harder the moment she felt slighted. The first sign of retaliation came subtly, almost like a warning. One morning, I walked outside to find my traffic cones tipped over, lying scattered in the street. The chains I had neatly locked between them were dragged across the pavement, scraped and tangled, as if someone had tried to rip them apart. At first I thought maybe it was kids playing a prank, but deep down I knew better. Karen had made her move. The next day, I noticed her pacing along the sidewalk, phone in hand, snapping pictures of my barricades from every angle. She wasn't quiet about it, either. She pointed, gestured, muttered loudly enough for passing neighbors to hear. It was a performance, staged for an audience. Within a week, a letter from the HOA appeared in my mailbox. They had received complaints that my barricades were not in line with community standards and demanded I remove them immediately. It was Karen's handwriting all over. She hadn't just tried to destroy my fortress, she had gone for a bigger weapon, bureaucracy. But what she didn't expect was my preparation. I had measured every inch of that spot, checked property lines, and documented my construction process with photos and receipts. Every chain, every cone, every post was firmly planted inside my boundary. So when the HOA tried to threaten me with fines, I fought back with paperwork. I sent them proof, chapter and verse from their own rulebook, showing that I had broken no regulations. When they tried to argue, I doubled down, ceasing local officials and even the county zoning department in my responses. If Karen thought I would back down when the HOA entered the fight, she was wrong. I wasn't just defending a parking space, I was defending my right not to be bullied. And that's when Karen escalated again. Late at night, I began to notice strange things. Trash scattered across my yard. Eggs splattered on my mailbox. A smear of ketchup across my driveway one morning. Small, petty acts of vandalism meant to annoy, to wear me down, to send a message that she wasn't going anywhere. I knew it was her. The timing, the frequency, the way it always targeted the fortress or the property around it hit had Karen written all over it. But she was careful, never leaving proof, never letting herself be seen. Then came the boldest move yet. One evening, as I pulled into the neighborhood, I saw Karen's car parked directly in front of my barricade. Not in the space she couldn't get in anymore, but across from it, halfway into the street, blocking traffic. She stood there, arms crossed, glaring at my house as though daring me to come outside and challenge her. Neighbors peeked from their windows, some shaking their heads, others smirking at the spectacle. She wanted a scene. I didn't give her one. Instead, I waited, biding my time. Because I knew something she didn't. My cameras had caught everything. Weeks before, when the first acts of vandalism started, I had installed motion sensor cameras around my property. Small, discreet, but sharp enough to catch every move. And now I had hours of footage Karen tipping over cones, dragging chains, scattering trash in the night. I had her caught red-handed, undeniable proof of her campaign against me. But I didn't release the evidence immediately. No, that would have been too easy. Instead, I decided to let her dig herself deeper. Let her escalate until the entire neighborhood could see just how far she was willing to go. Because once I unleashed the footage, it wouldn't just embarrass her, would ruin her credibility completely. Karen thought she was playing a game of intimidation, but I was preparing for something bigger. My fortress wasn't just physical anymore. It had become symbolic. A test of wills, a battle of persistence. And while she tried to wear me down with petty acts and HOA letters, I was gathering ammunition that would eventually end the war once and for all. Still, the tension grew thicker by the day. Neighbors whispered about the feud, some siding with me, others quietly sympathizing with Karen just to avoid her wrath. The HOA wavered, unsure how much control they truly had over the situation. And Karen only grew bolder, convinced she was untouchable. But the truth was, her downfall had already begun. She just didn't know it yet. And as I reviewed the growing archive of footage stored neatly on my computer, I realized the fortress had done more than protect my parking space. It had drawn a line in the sand, one Karen had crossed again and again, leaving behind a trail of evidence that would soon turn the entire neighborhood against her. The fortress was only the beginning. The real revenge was still to come.
The neighborhood takes sides by the time Karen's nightly vandalism had become routine. The rest of the neighborhood was already buzzing with whispers. People had begun to notice the fortress, the barricades, and the quiet battle playing out between me and the woman across the street. In a community where even the color of your mailbox could stir gossip, our feud had become the main event. At first, most neighbors stayed neutral. They watched from their porches, peeked through curtains, and kept their opinions to themselves. But as Karen grew bolder, her actions harder to ignore, the neighborhood began to divide. Some neighbors admired my persistence. They saw the fortress not as an eyesore, but as a clever stand against the tyranny of the HOA and the overreach of Karen. They'd wave at me in quiet support, some even dropping subtle comments like, "Good for you," or "Don't let her win." These people understood the unspoken rule of suburban living. Once you let a Karen take something from you, she'll never stop. Others, however, were less supportive. Karen had spent years weaving herself into the fabric of neighborhood politics. She was the one who reminded people to put their trash bins away on time. She was the one who helpfully pointed out overgrown lawns or peeling paint. To some, she was a nuisance, but to others, she was a necessary enforcer of order. These neighbors, though quieter, began to echo her complaints. They said my barricades made the street look cluttered. They worried that property values would fall. They whispered that maybe I was being just as petty as Karen. It was a cold war on our street. Divided glances, hushed conversations, and subtle acts of allegiance. The HOA, of course, hovered nervously in the middle. They wanted the problem gone, swept under the rug before it drew too much attention. But with Karen pushing them to act and me pushing back with legal proof, they were stuck in a stalemate. Each letter they sent me was met with documentation and counterpoints. Each complaint they received was tangled up with my evidence of harassment and vandalism. The Fortress had become a thorn they couldn't easily pull out. Meanwhile, Karen's behavior grew more desperate. No longer satisfied with quiet acts of sabotage, she turned to public humiliation. She'd stand outside her house whenever I arrived home, arms folded, shaking her head dramatically as though my fortress were some personal attack on her dignity. She complained loudly to anyone within earshot, ranting about how selfish and childish I was. But what she didn't realize was that her theatrics were backfiring. The more she drew attention to the feud, the more people began to question her side of the story. Why was she so invested in a parking space that wasn't hers? Why was she constantly circling my house at night, caught again and again on my cameras? Why was she willing to disrupt the peace of the neighborhood over something so small? The cracks in her influence began to show. A few neighbors who once defended her started to distance themselves. They still didn't openly side with me, but their silence spoke volumes. Karen noticed, too, and it only fueled her fury. The tipping point came one Saturday morning. I woke to the sound of raised voices outside. When I stepped onto my porch, I saw Karen locked in a heated argument with one of the families down the street. They were tired of her constant meddling, tired of her complaints, tired of her dragging them into drama that wasn't theirs. Soon, other neighbors joined in. The crowd swelling as frustrations long kept quiet spilled out into the open. Karen had wanted to paint me as the villain, but in her obsession, she had turned the spotlight on herself, and in that spotlight, her controlling, manipulative nature was impossible to ignore. For the first time, the fortress wasn't just my defense, it had become a symbol for others too, a symbol of resistance against her endless need for control. But Karen wasn't finished yet. She retreated from that confrontation, but I could see the storm brewing in her eyes. She wasn't going to give up, not when her grip on the neighborhood was slipping away. If anything, she was preparing for something bigger, something drastic, a move that would either crush me completely or finally bring about her downfall. And as I sat that evening, reviewing the latest footage on my computer, I realized the neighborhood wasn't just watching anymore, they were choosing sides. And in battles like this, once the lines are drawn, there's no going back. The fortress had sparked a war, and the next round was coming soon. The HOA strikes back by now. The feud between me and Karen wasn't just a private dispute. It had spilled out into the neighborhood, dividing households, fueling gossip, and testing the fragile peace of our community. For weeks, the fortress stood untouched. My cameras rolled silently in the background, and Karen seethed with growing desperation. But when her influence over the neighbors began to falter, she turned to her strongest weapon yet, the HOA. It started with another letter, but this one was different. Unlike the earlier warnings filled with vague threats, this one carried weight. The HOA board had called for a special meeting to review violations of community standards. The language was firm, the tone unmistakable. They were coming for the fortress. On the night of the meeting, I walked into the HOA clubhouse to find the place buzzing with tension. Neighbors filled the folding chairs, whispering in small groups, some casting nervous glances at me, others glaring openly. At the front of the room sat the board, their faces stern, their folders stacked high with papers, no doubt a collection of Karen's complaints, and carefully chosen photos. And in the center of it all, like a queen awaiting her coronation, sat Karen herself, arms folded, lips curled in a smug grin. The meeting was less about fairness and more about theater. Karen took the floor early, presenting her case against me with dramatic flair. She described the fortress as an eyesore, a hazard, a reckless obstruction of neighborhood aesthetics. She waved around printouts of photos, each one angled to make the barricades look larger, uglier, more intrusive than they really were. She framed it as a battle for the soul of the community, a desperate attempt to preserve order against a neighbor who had gone rogue. The board listened politely, nodding, jotting down notes, and when they turned to me, I was ready. Calmly, methodically, I laid out my defense. Property line maps, receipts for materials, citations from the HOA's own bylaws, proof that every piece of the fortress was legal, compliant, and well within my rights. And then, for the finishing blow, I presented the footage on the screen. The room watched as Karen appeared again and again on my cameras, dragging chains across the pavement, tossing trash onto my yard, crouching in the dark as she tipped over cones. Each clip was undeniable. each one another nail in the coffin of her credibility. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen's smug grin cracked, her face flushing with anger as she sputtered excuses. But the damage was done. The board, caught off guard, shifted uneasily. They couldn't side with her now, not openly. Not with the entire neighborhood watching. Instead, they issued a watered-down ruling. The fortress could stay, but modifications were required to improve its appearance. They wanted compromise, something to appease Karen without admitting she had been wrong. To me, it was victory enough. The fortress remained standing. The HOA hadn't dared order its removal, and Karen had been humiliated in front of the very people she sought to control. But humiliation has a way of igniting fury. In the days that followed, Karen withdrew from her usual theatrics. No more shouting on sidewalks, no more public complaints. She was quiet, almost too quiet. And in that silence, I sensed danger. The HOA's ruling had tied her hands, at least officially. But Karen didn't need official channels to make life miserable. She was vindictive, cunning, and now wounded. And a wounded Karen is far more dangerous than a victorious one. Strange things began to happen in the neighborhood. Flyers appeared in mailboxes, anonymous but unmistakably her work, warning about declining standards and neighbors who don't care about property values. Small cliques of homeowners began whispering again, swayed by her persistent fear-mongering. And late at night, I'd still catch glimpses of her pacing the sidewalk, phone in hand, staring at the fortress like it was a personal enemy. The HOA might have tried to settle the matter, but for Karen, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And as I stood at my window one evening, watching her glare at my house from across the street, I realized that the next move would be hers. The fortress had survived the HOA strike, but the war was far from finished. Karen wasn't done. She was just regrouping. For weeks after the HOA meeting, Karen simmered in silence. Her defeat had been public, undeniable, and deeply humiliating. Neighbors who once nodded along to her complaints now avoided her. The fortress still stood tall, a daily reminder of the battle she had lost. And I thought, perhaps naively, that the worst was behind me. But Karen wasn't the type to lick her wounds and move on. She was the type to brood, to scheme, to let her resentment fester until it boiled over into something reckless. And soon enough, her silence ended. It began with little signs that she was watching me more closely than ever. When I left for work, in the morning, I'd catch her blinds shifting just slightly, as if she'd been peeking out. When I returned in the evening, I'd notice her standing on her porch, arms crossed, eyes locked on me as if daring me to acknowledge her. Even when I went about normal chores, watering the plants, carrying groceries inside, I could feel her gaze burning into me from across the street. The vandalism started again, but this time it was bolder. My trash bins were tipped over in the night, their contents scattered across my lawn. Deep scratches appeared on my mailbox, as if someone had dragged a key across it. One morning, I found one of the solar lights from the fortress smashed to pieces, shards glittering on the pavement. Each act was small enough that she could deny it if accused, but obvious enough that I knew exactly who was responsible. And then came the incident that crossed the line completely. It was just past midnight when I woke to a loud clanging sound outside. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe a stray animal knocking something over. But when I checked my cameras, what I saw froze me in place. Karen was in my driveway, not on the sidewalk. Not hovering near the edge of her property, she was on mine. In the grainy night vision footage, I watched her circle the fortress like a predator, tugging on the chains, kicking at the posts, pulling at the barricades as though trying to tear, then down with her bare hands. At one point, she even crouched low, inspecting the bolts in the ground as if searching for a weakness. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was obsessed. I sat there in the glow of my computer screen, heart pounding, torn between storming outside to confront her and calling the police immediately. In the end, I chose neither. Instead, I let the cameras roll. I wanted every second captured, every incriminating detail recorded. By the time she finally stormed off into the night, red-faced and defeated, I had everything I needed. The next morning, I reviewed the footage again, and the weight of it sank in. This wasn't petty vandalism anymore. Karen had trespassed. She had invaded my property, crossed the one line that no neighbor should ever cross. And in doing so, She had given me the ammunition to end this war once and for all. But ending it wouldn't be simple. Karen wasn't the type to back down, even when cornered. If I went to the police, she would scream about harassment, about conspiracies, about how I was targeting her unfairly. If I brought it to the HOA, she would rally her few remaining allies and spin the story into something else. I knew I needed to play this carefully, and more importantly, I needed the neighborhood to see the truth for themselves, so I waited. I didn't confront her immediately. I didn't post the footage online or storm into an HOA meeting waving it around. Instead, I bided my time, quietly strengthening the fortress even more. Heavy steel reinforcements appeared around the posts. The chains were upgraded to industrial grade. And this time, I added something new, motion sensor floodlights that bathed the entire spot in blinding white. Light at the slightest movement. Karen didn't know it yet, but the trap was set. The following week, it happened again. Another midnight visit. Another attempt to tamper with the barricades. But this time, the moment she stepped into my driveway, the floodlights erupted, illuminating her in full view of the street. Cameras caught every detail, her face twisted with rage, her hands yanking desperately at the chains. Her frantic scramble to escape once she realized she was caught in the open. And unlike before, this time, neighbors saw it too. Curtains twitched, doors cracked open, people whispered from porches as Karen, humiliated and exposed, fled back to her house. The line had been crossed, and there was no hiding it now. By morning, the story was everywhere. Neighbors who had once stayed silent were suddenly eager to talk, eager to share their own run-ins with Karen, eager to finally push back against the woman who had controlled them for so long. My cameras had given them proof, but her actions had given them reason. Karen thought she was fighting me alone, but in reality, she had just turned the entire neighborhood against her. And as I sat that evening, reviewing the latest footage and listening to the whispers outside, I realized that the fortress had done more than protect my parking space. It had exposed Karen for who she truly was. But the war wasn't finished yet. The final act was still coming, the one that would decide, once and for all, who truly ruled the neighborhood. By the time Karen was exposed under the blinding glare of the floodlights, her grip on the neighborhood had shattered. For years, she had thrived on intimidation, on whispers, on the power of being the loudest voice in the room. But that night, when the cameras caught her, trespassing in plain view of half the street, the illusion collapsed. No amount of excuses could undo what everyone had seen with their own eyes. Still, Karen wasn't the type to surrender gracefully. She fought on, even as her allies dwindled. She flooded the HOA with frantic emails, each one more desperate than the last, accusing me of harassment, of manipulation, even of setting traps to make her look bad. She marched up and down the street, ranting about how the fortress was ruining property values. But where once the neighbors might have nodded along in silence, now they turned away. Garage doors closed when she approached. Conversations ended abruptly when she drew near. She was isolated, but still dangerous. The HOA, pressured by her relentless complaints, called for one final meeting. This time, it wasn't just about me or the fortress, it was about Karen herself. Her behavior had become a liability, a source of embarrassment for the very board she once influenced. And with the neighborhood divided, they needed resolution. The meeting was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Neighbors packed the clubhouse, their voices buzzing like a swarm. At the front sat the board, weary and exasperated. Karen arrived late, storming in with a folder clutched tightly in her hands, her face red with determination. And I sat quietly, my evidence prepared, waiting for the inevitable clash. Karen went first, unleashing a tirade of accusations. She waved her arms, slammed her folder onto the table, shouted about conspiracies and vendettas. She painted herself as the victim, insisting that I had targeted her, that the fortress was a deliberate attack on her, that I had manipulated the cameras to make her look guilty. Her words echoed through the room, but the more she spoke, the more desperate she sounded. Then it was my turn. Calmly, I presented the timeline. Photos of the barricades, each one well within property lines. Copies of the bylaws showing my compliance. And finally, the footage unedited, undeniable. Crystal clear. Clip after clip played on the screen. Karen scattering trash, vandalizing property, trespassing in the night, and finally, The moment the floodlights revealed her in front of the entire neighborhood, gasps rippled through the room. Neighbors exchanged looks, shaking their heads, muttering under their breath. The board sat in stunned silence, their pens frozen above their notepads. And Karen, her face drained of color, her lips pressed tight, could do nothing but watch as her credibility crumbled before her eyes. When the footage ended, the decision was swift. The HOA issued Karen a formal violation, fining her for harassment and trespassing. She was stripped of her voting privileges on the board, banned from attending meetings until her fines were paid. It wasn't just a loss, it was a public dethroning, a complete dismantling of the power she had wielded for years. The fortress remained untouched, sanctioned now not just by my persistence, but by the very board that once tried to tear it down. And Karen, humiliated and defeated, retreated to her house across the street, her windows shuttered, her blinds drawn tight. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood transformed. The whispers quieted, the tension eased, and for the first time in years, people felt free to breathe without Karen's watchful eye hovering over them. Neighbors who had once avoided me now stopped by to chat, offering quiet congratulations, sharing their own stories of battles they'd endured with her. The fortress, once mocked as an eyesore, became a kind of legend, a symbol of standing your ground when pushed too far. And as for Karen, she kept to herself. The sight of her car parked defiantly in front of my house was gone forever. The fortress had done its job, but more importantly, it had ended a war that had consumed the street. Looking back, I realized it was never really about the parking spot. It was about control, about boundaries, about refusing to be bullied into submission. The fortress was more than concrete and chains. It was a declaration that everyone, no matter how loud or petty their opponent, had the right to defend what was theirs. The war was over. The fortress stood tall, and Karen's reign was finished.